Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome to the end of World War II. What I'd like to do with this next presentation, it's only 10 slides, so this shouldn't take too much time. But instead of making you take notes or read anything about the legacy of World War II, I thought try something a little bit different this time. What I'll do is I'll go over these slides and explain everything to you as carefully as possible. And then your assignment will be to summarize the results of World War II in a paragraph and send a written paragraph back in to me for your next assignment, which will be due on Friday the 10th. Okay, now you can handwrite your paragraph, you can type it. It doesn't matter how you put together your summary of the slides in your own words, but please be careful and do use your own words as much as you can. So getting on to the results of World War II. First off, let's remember that World War II was the costliest war in human history. If you look here, you can see the estimated number of casualties, both military and civilian, for the major countries of the war. Now remember, it was a world war, but these are just the major countries who were involved. But as you can see at the bottom right, the total estimated number of deaths in 1945 from World War II, civilian and military, were over 50 million souls. That's a lot of people for a 5-year war. So you can see World War II represents a continual growing and industrialized warfare of mass production in both weapons and ways of killing people, but also in massive amounts of death. The biggest legacy, the biggest change to come out of World War II is the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union, which is the communist Russia, will have emerged from World War II stronger than when they went into it, especially the United States, but even the Soviet Union, hard to believe as much as they suffered from German invasions, actually came out stronger at the end of two, and they will become the world's first two superpowers. Now, the reason that is important, which I'll talk about shortly, is that for the next 40 years, the United States and the Soviet Union will be at war with each other. But it's not a war where we're actually, pulling rifles out on each other and shooting each other. It's actually called a Cold War. And I'll explain that further down in the slides. But by 1948, the United States dropped nuclear bombs in 1945 on Japan. By 1948, the Soviet Union, their spies had stolen our technology, and they had actually successfully test fired their own nuclear weapons. And that's what also began the nuclear arms race. What happened to Europe? Well, first off, the parts of Europe that the Soviet Union had overrun while they were pushing the Germans back out of Russia until the Germans surrendered. These are about where the Russian soldiers were when Germany surrendered. Now, in the Malta and Potsdam conferences, it had been agreed, reluctantly, of course, by Joseph Stalin, that these nations that existed before World War II began in 1939 were going to be allowed once again to be self-determining independent nations. But Joseph Stalin broke his promise. And wherever his soldiers were when Germany surrendered, his soldiers stayed and basically used their muscle, their military muscle. The Soviet Union created puppet governments in these nations here to create communism in these nations. And Stalin justified it by saying he wanted to have a buffer zone between the rest of Europe and the Soviet Union so that an invasion such as what happened with Germany will never happen again. So these nations were forcibly, at the point of a gun by the Soviet military, forced into becoming communist nations. Now, this black line here actually represents what is symbolized by, we call it the Iron Curtain. The term Iron Curtain was given by Winston Churchill in a speech when he visited in Missouri, actually in the United States, where when you can see the division of communism and democracy, capitalism in Europe, he described the division part right here as an iron curtain because, of course, all this communism was created at the point of a gun, the steel of a gun. So that's where that comes from. The Cold War, you can see here written in red, the definition is there. Definitely, you need to understand what the Cold War was. Obviously, it'd be great that you explain it to me in your little summary paragraph at the end of your lesson, but you do not need to write any notes from these slides into your notebook. This is a different kind of learning lesson. We don't need to take notes on this. You'll summarize this writing, of course, in your summary paragraph to me. Germany itself, this time, was divided. The whole country of Germany was divided and created 4 zones out of it. Okay, you can hear, this is actually where the Soviet armies were when Germany surrendered, that they had overrun. So this part belonged to the Soviet Union. This part was given to Britain. Here over here belongs to France, and then the United States administrated this part. Now, the agreement was that the Allies would do this to Germany so that we could rebuild Germany, get them back on their feet, self-governing nation, and then reunify the 4 parts into another new Germany that would be a peaceful Germany. And that way, by doing it the kind way and helping rebuild them ourselves, the idea was that there would be no rise to power of another kind of Hitler, and Germany would not have the troubles that they encountered after World War I in the Treaty of Versailles. This is the way it was set up. Also, the city of Berlin, the capital city, which is inside the Russian zone, was also divided into these 4 sectors. The same 4 allies also had their own sector in Berlin, the capital city. And from Berlin to the British zone, for example, and also from Berlin to the US zone, there were special highways, corridors, where our trucks and supplies and stuff could go from our zones, the Allied zones, into the Soviet zone. It was fenced off, of course. You couldn't stray around and travel. You had to go straight to Berlin, and you were searched and stuff like that. But then we can, feed the people in the sections of Berlin that did not have contact with the Soviets, because the Soviets were not happy about having to share Berlin, but they weren't going to fight a war over it. What's happened in Asia? Well, after World War II was over and Japan surrendered, the communists in China will finally win their civil war, and China will become a communist nation. And actually, in the beginning, they'll become very friendly with the Soviet Union, who gave the communist revolutionaries a lot of weapons to help them win. You also see here the Korean Peninsula. This is the Korean Peninsula right here. By the time Japan surrendered, the Soviet armies had already been fighting the Japanese back, and this is about where the Soviet military had arrived by the time of the Japanese surrender. So, of course, they could not go any further because any other aggression on their part would be a new kind of aggression outside of World War II. So the Americans actually occupied this part to make sure also that the Soviets wouldn't push further south. And as a result, because the Soviet Union would not withdraw, a new nation here in the Korean Peninsula known as the North Korea, was created with a puppet dictator who was the grandfather of, I can't remember what the guy's name, Kim Jong-un or Jim, whatever. They changed the variation of the same 3 words, it seems like. But it's his grandson today who's a dictator. He was put up as a puppet ruler of a communist North Korea. And then the United States, with the help of the United Nations, which I'll talk about next, created a new democratic South Korea. As for Japan, her entire empire that she had created by conquering in World War II was removed from her. And the only thing left for Japan were her main islands right here. This is Japan here. And actually, the United States, we occupied the island of Japan under the generalship of Douglas MacArthur, who basically, he was even more powerful than the emperor, of course, in Japan. He could have, actually, he was the one who made the decision not to execute the emperor, for war crimes. He decided to allow the emperor to remain in office, for a good measure, for good relations. And basically, the United States went about the task of rebuilding Japan. We also wrote for them and gave them their own constitution and made so many other changes to their culture that Japan became very westernized, with the democratic constitution. And obviously, this is the country who they have emerged into today, a powerful industrial giant once again. The League of Nations no longer existed after World War II. So the mistakes that were learned from the weaknesses of the League of Nations were taken out of the charter that created the League of Nations, and a new international organization was created, which you've all heard of, is the United Nations, which is basically the same thing as the League of Nations, but the United Nations has muscle. Okay? They have peacekeepers. If you've ever seen any soldiers with the blue helmets with the symbol on it, this United Nations symbol, those are United Nations peacekeepers. And they pack up, they have a muscle now. Let's just put it that way. United Nations is a very successful organization in today's world. What happened to the Germans and the Japanese for their war crimes, or for their crimes against humanity? Well, to be honest with you, there were no such things called crimes against humanity until the end of World War II, when it was learned about the atrocities of the Holocaust, which killed those 11 million Europeans, and what the Japanese had been doing also. This is when the world had grown disgusted, and suddenly now there are crimes against humanity that people are going to be judged for their actions. It began in Germany, in the city of Nuremberg, with the Nuremberg war trials. And basically, you can see these are the remaining leaders of the Nazi Party. There were, I think, 16 altogether. Don't quote me on that number, it's not necessary. Of the leaders of the Nazi Party, who were all held responsible for their actions of the war. Not only, of course, of like bombing innocent civilians. This is Goering, who's the head of the Luftwaffe, did the bombing, the Blitz, and killing all the civilians like that by airplane bombing. But you also have the leaders of several of the concentration camps where all of these people were exterminated and things like that. For the most part, several of them were executed, found guilty and executed for war crimes. Several of them spent the rest of their lives in prison, and then a few others spent 15, maybe 20 years in prison for their crimes, and then were released. And then there were like two, maybe three, who were actually released. They were found not guilty for the accusations that had been brought against them for one reason or the other. But this marks a new precedent in world history, in the sense that we hold leaders of countries responsible for the consequences of their actions taken during war or even during peacetime, of other kinds of atrocities. And the same thing happened with Japan. In Tokyo, we had the Japanese war crime trials. You can see here on the right, this was Tojo, who was the leader of the army in charge. He was the prime minister of Japan. He was the real political power of Japan with the army behind him. But they were held responsible for many of the atrocities in China. Now, believe it or not, I think I'm 99% sure, even still to today, Japan has never apologized for the rape of Nanjing. But other examples of the atrocities they committed, the Japanese, and actually the Germans did this too with Dr. Death. His name was Dr. Death in Germany, but the Japanese also had Unit 731, which were doctors who experimented on, obviously, Chinese prisoners. Strange and bizarre experiments and horrible, horrible tortures that these human beings would have to have endured for the fact of, they claimed it was, learning more science. But that's basically, in a nutshell, the main changes and things that happened as a result of World War II. What I'd like to ask you to do now is please take your time, maybe watch this another time or two, put together your plan, and then write me a paragraph. I'm not requiring a length, I'm requiring quality. And repeat to me, summarize what I just